Alright, this time I'm going to be talking about another Murakami novel, because of course I am, because it's called One Cheek Books because I half-ass everything, but maybe it should be called One Cheek Books because the other cheek is always dedicated to sucking Murakami's cock, or something like that. Anyway, point is, this week I'm going to be talking about The City and Its Uncertain Walls, which is Murakami's latest book, and it's translated, as most of Murakami's recent works are, by Phillip Gabriel. And the reason that I picked this book is because I've read it 2 times this year. I wasn't able to get a hold of a copy until January, so this is my 3rd time reading through it this year. I was going to read Wind Up Bird Chronicle again. I'm really in the mood to read that book, but due to reasons that I cannot talk about, I am putting that off for the time being. And instead, I decided to revisit The City and Its Uncertain Walls because it's not a super long book like Killing Commendatore or Wind Up Bird Chronicle, which are, I'm kind of in the mood to read. But obviously, if you can't tell from the time between uploads, I haven't had a whole lot of time to read lately, which I've been saying a lot, but that's been evening out. I've actually, this past week, had a lot of time to read. But also, when it comes to Murakami, I like to really take my time and savor it. So that is why I chose The City and Its Uncertain Walls. And a brief plot synopsis of this book. So I kind of hate to do this, to talk about this thing that everybody who ever talks about this book is going to talk about. So I'm going to do it really quickly, really briefly, because I assume you already know this if you're here, but if you don't, it'll be important to quickly catch you up. This is actually based on a novella that Murakami wrote many years ago. I think it's like 40 years ago. He wrote this novella, and he wasn't happy with it. And if you don't know, in Japan, it was common for things to be published in literary magazines before they were published into a book. And this novella, he never actually allowed to be published into a book because he wasn't proud of it. And as it explains at the end of The City and Its Uncertain Walls in an afterword by the author, he did revisit this concept in Hard-Boiled Wonderland in the End of the World, or End of the World in Hard-Boiled Wonderland, depending on which translation you're reading. And he used the short story, and then he wrote the novella rather, and then he wrote a new story, and they went along parallel and then merged at the end. So that was one way of approaching it, but what he says he wanted to do was to come back and to take the story and give it its full due without merging it into another story. So what you have here is a book with 3 parts, where the first part, the first 127 pages of the story, are essentially the novella that he wrote previously, which he has gone back and touched up. And then the parts continuing from there, parts 2 and 3, are new material that he has written to complement and sort of flesh out and finish the story. So in that sense, the synopsis is the first part, the novella, tells a dual tale of the protagonist, and it alternates between chapters. Basically, it's told in first person, second person, as though he's writing a letter to a girl. The protagonist has no name, and the girl has no name, where he's talking about when they were 17, he meets this girl, and they fall in love, and she describes to him a city, claiming that she's nothing more than a shadow, and that her true self resides in this city. So he takes it upon himself to sort of document this city, and the first prong of the narrative follows his relationship with this girl and her eventual abrupt disappearance with no explanation, while the second prong follows the man in his 40s as he wakes up inside this town and separates from his shadow to enter this town and become its dream reader, where in this town there's a version of this girl who is still her 16-year-old self, and it's about his time in this town and the things he sort of experiences and sees in this fantastical town. And then the novella obviously has its obvious conclusion, and then part 2 continues from the story of the protagonist in the real world and goes forward from there. So would I recommend this book? It's a Murakami novel. I absolutely would always recommend Murakami's novels. For my personal placement for this one, I would place it below his very best tier, but still pretty high. I think the thing with Murakami's works, and this, I'll probably get into it in the themes a bit, but when I talked about Colorless Tskuru Tazaki I really mentioned how it had a lot of parallels with Sputnik Sweetheart, but then followed it many years later. Like dealing with trauma and whatnot, but rather than approaching that, like Sputnik Sweetheart did, it sort of took the main character and very much removed them in terms of time chronologically from their trauma, but how that trauma still affects them. So I feel like really a lot of his books after 1Q84, while they do absolutely stand on their own, Murakami is known for repeating themes. And each one of his books after 1Q84 feels to me like there's a lot of themes reflected in a lot of his older books. So Colorless and Sputnik feel very much connected in the way that they sort of re-explore some of the similar themes, but with Murakami as an older, more experienced writer. In that sense, Killing Commendatore, I on the surface, it has a lot in common with Wind Up Bird Chronicle, but I think that there are a lot of things about it that are different, that it, more so than the other two books, stands on its own as its own thing. But definitely, a lot of people know a lot of similar elements from Wind Up Bird Chronicle, and they are there. They're just kind of inverted. And now we have The City and Its Uncertain Walls, which isn't quite a reflection of Hard-Boiled Wonderland at the End of the World, but still, again, being that it stems from the same core novella, still feels like a reflection of a lot of Murakami's older themes, but through the lens of somebody older and with a slightly different take on things. So approaching it from that way in terms of a recommendation, it's something that you could read as your first Murakami novel, but I would still recommend, Kafka on the Shore, Wind Up Bird Chronicle, Norwegian Wood first. But if this is something that you read the description and it sounds really captivating, then go for it. It's not the worst place to jump in. If you've already read some of Murakami's other novels, then there's no reason to put this one off. So I would definitely recommend it to anybody interested in Murakami. Just maybe not the first, but it's not the worst place to start. Moving on from there to the pros and the cons. In terms of the pros, it's really interesting because you get a mixture of Murakami's writing style between his older, more tightly focused work and his current, his older, more tightly written prose and his current, more, when I say meandering, it kind of gives the image of somebody who's lost. And I think of it more as sort of going through it more slowly, taking in more details, more description and things like that. And the first time I read the book, I didn't care for the first part and really enjoyed the second and third part, his more modern writing. But reading it this time, I actually found the first part really poignant, and the second and third part still good, but not feeling as poignant. So I, in terms of sort of a pro or a con, or really anything, whether this is a pro or con, I guess is up to you, but it has both elements of his writing. So if you're a fan of his older work, you'll get some of that. If you're a fan of his newer work, you'll get more of that. So you have both of them together. And again, in terms of a con, I would say that it's not as deep as a lot of Murakami's other novels of this length. This is sort of a Norwegian Wood Kafka length. And I don't think it has quite as many themes that it's bouncing around, or as many characters, nor does it really quite explore those themes as deeply or as nuanced as those books. And I think it's kind of the consequence of being a novella, because part one really does stand on its own, and then you have sort of a novel latched on after it, and that novel itself, well, decent in length, is not quite as long as the whole thing leads you to believe. So like most of the cases I should say, because the characters in the novel part of it are entirely new and need to be introduced, and in many ways even the main character needs to be reintroduced, it ends up really feeling like an isolated sort of thing that makes callbacks to the novella more so than a sort of natural continuation, and consequently, well, the whole thing may be in length with Norwegian Wood or Kafka. It doesn't have the cohesion and consequently it doesn't get quite as deep into things as those books do. But I still think, in terms of the prose, I still like what it has to say, and it's still far from vapid. And being a Murakami novel, it still has that quality of really you get out of it as much as you bring into it, as is sort of the case with any major work of surrealist or magical realist narrative, because anytime that there's heavy metaphor or heavy symbolism, it ends up being as much a reflection of the reader as anything else. So, in terms of, I guess, the best way to really sum up this whole section is in terms of the prose, it's everything you enjoy about Murakami. In terms of the cons, it's everything you may not enjoy about Murakami, and coupled with the fact that the sort of presentation of it ends up feeling less than the sum of its whole. But I still think, in terms of his oeuvre, it stands as a sort of nice above average work by Murakami. And so now I'm going to get into themes. So this is your last chance to bail before full spoilers. But the theme of this book, really, the core central theme, is moving on from the kind of trauma or grief or loss that can split your life in two. So we have sort of shadows, which are, in this book, a metaphor for what happens to a person when they experience a sudden change in their life and they suddenly become kind of like a new person. You can't go on being the same old person, so you can end up feeling like a shadow of your former self. And at first, there's this sort of clear divide between shadow and person, but as the story goes on, you start to see that the division between shadow and individual is not necessarily as clear cut, because once you deal with a really heavy piece of trauma, you can go on feeling like you're a shadow of your former self, but eventually over time that shadow self does end up sort of becoming the new you and becoming full and enriched, and at which point the sort of previous version becomes the shadow because it's in the past, and the current you is full and enriched in a way that a memory of yourself could never be. So that's really what the protagonist is going through. And I think one of the interesting things about this book specifically is that it is so focused on the protagonist's sort of character and his reaction to it, in contrast to something like Colorless, where while it is mostly focused on Tsukuru's reaction to the trauma, there are also the other characters, Aoi, Aki, Kuro, and Shiro, and how they were also affected. And through Tsukuru's journey, you reconnected with each of the characters and sort of heard their interpretations and how they were impacted by the splitting of their group. Whereas in The City and the Uncertain Walls, we are as clueless as the protagonist as regards the fate of the girl and later on the Yellow Submarine Boy. There are lots of things sprinkled throughout that the first part that suggests that the girl's life is not very comfortable, that she may have some problems at home, and it's very easy to draw a certain, a conclusion like she committed suicide or something like that. But ultimately, the protagonist never knows, and we never know. And you can kind of drive yourself nuts trying to come up with an explanation, or you can take your own explanation and say, this is my answer and I'm sticking to it. But the fact of the matter is, there's just not enough information there to tell either way. But this is sort of reflects real life in the way that sometimes people do fall out of our lives, and we will never be able to know the cause or the reason. And I think the book does a really interesting thing in sort of eschewing the typical sort of style of fiction, especially nowadays, where there's this sort of urge to give every single person's side of the story, to create this kind of epic. And while I appreciate that in terms of it being one sort of type of storytelling, or one approach to storytelling, because you can have a character that from one perspective seems really harsh and unfair, but then you go into that character's head and you start to see their justifications and their way of seeing the world, and all of a sudden the character that you were previously sympathetic towards, you realize may not be as sympathetic as you thought, and then you jump to a third character, and what ends up happening is you start to see how maybe right or wrong doesn't exist, and sympathy is really in the eye of the beholder. And the point being that there's a lot that you can accomplish and do with this sort of epic, mind-hopping, perspective-shifting type of story. Murakami often in his works eschews that completely, limiting us to only one point of view, which personally I really like, because our own lives are only lived from one point of view. And just as it is important to have fiction that can break the rules of reality and show us other people's points of views and the sort of nuance and complexity of that, so too does there need to be fiction that reflects reality and really digs into how we can cope with the fact that we will never know other people's points of view. We can never become another person. We can empathize, but as is kind of the big theme of the Wind Up Bird Chronicle, with the question, how much can you know and how well can you ever really know another person? There's obviously limits to that, and yet still we have to live our lives, and we have to live and interact with each other, and we have to accept that these are the potential consequences of that, and how do we live with those consequences? The protagonist, obviously, when the girl leaves him, he is unable to form any solid connections with anybody else in his life, which the wall inside of himself and the city is a sort of metaphor or parallel for his inner self, and he kind of locks himself inside of it, and it's a stasis state. This is why the girl in the city is 16, because that's how he remembers her, and he will not let things in the city age or shift, because he isn't able to sort of move forward past this trauma. But we see at the end with the Yellow Submarine Boy, who sort of isn't really the Yellow Submarine Boy, because this is in his place. The Yellow Submarine Boy even says, "I'm you and you're me." So it's not the Yellow Submarine Boy. It's a facet of himself, but he lets the Yellow Submarine Boy into the city, into his heart, because of what happened. And again, you can draw your own conclusions about why, but we'll get to that later. But he lets the Yellow Submarine Boy, he merges with him, and eventually the part of him that is trapped in this city leaves the city. And during this time, towards the end, he actually mentions in his final visit with the girl that she does seem to be aging. She does seem to be a little different, which is sort of suggests to me that time is starting to finally move forward into this town inside his heart. So the theme is also explored through two other characters, kind of. You have the old man, Mr. Koyasu, who is the librarian and who is dead, who likewise has experienced a sort of tragic moment in his history, which split him in two. And so he too argues that, he is a shadow of his former self. And yet at the same time, even though he is dead, he still has ties to the world of the living that keep him there. So not only do you have this sort of dynamic of inner and outer self, and sort of previous you and a current you, but you also have this contrast of like living and dead, where even though Mr. Koyasu is dead, he is no longer, as he says it, of this world. He nonetheless continues to inhabit this world and engage with it. On the flip side, you have the Yellow Submarine Boy, who is in this world, so to speak, and but doesn't fit in because he is clearly some type of neurodivergent. I'm not going to take any guess as to what, because I wouldn't have the slightest idea. Point is, he doesn't fit in here, so he wants to flee to that other world, escape to another world. So you have a ghost that is in the afterlife who exists in the quote-unquote real world. You have the boy who exists in the real world but wants to exist in the sort of other world, which is sort of the town, or it won't be the town, it will be his version of the town that exists sort of inside himself. And to be honest, the boy's disappearance towards the end of the book really baffled me, my first and second reading, because so far as I could tell, the only real logical conclusion that I could come up with was that the boy must have died. Because if you look at, again, those parallels, inner self, outer self, where outer self is portrayed as the sort of quote-unquote real world, or shadow self and real self, and then you have the world of the afterlife, and then this world, the real world, as he calls it when he's talking with Mr. Koyasu. So the question is then, if the boy in the Yellow Submarine t-shirt is no longer in this world and he has gone on to the other world, and people even say like he sloughed off his shell, his physical shell, then all signs point to me, to my interpretation, to him being dead, basically going out in the woods somewhere and dying. And yet at the same time, there is evidence in the book to suggest that he never would have left the house without his Yellow Submarine parka, and yet the parka is left behind, which runs counter to that theory, as well as the way that Mr. Koyasu reacts to the boy's desire to go to this city. He's very supportive of it, and the main character is seemingly supportive of it insofar as he thinks that, like, he feels the debate, but ultimately the fact that the boy just doesn't fit in so well with this world, he thinks that it might be better for him in the long run. So it's really difficult for me to think that Murakami would write a story where the boy's two people probably closest to the boy encourage him towards the sort of suicide or death state, and would treat this as anything positive, because it's difficult to imagine that as much as he cared for the boy, Mr. Koyasu would have encouraged that he end his life in any sort of way. But ultimately, I think that in Murakami's previous works, he's talked about how logic doesn't have anything to do with it, and sometimes there's not always a logical trail. And I think, considering what happened to the girl earlier in the story, again, it's another situation of we won't know what happened to Yellow Submarine Boy, and there's probably not an actual answer to what happened to Yellow Submarine Boy. It's another aspect of life and interacting with people where we have to accept that things will happen, we won't know about them, and we still have to continue to live our lives regardless. So in that sense, I don't know that anybody can really say necessarily what happened to Yellow Submarine Boy, but I don't think that insofar as understanding the themes of the book or what it's trying to get at, it's necessarily important that we understand his fate perfectly, because the significance is that by encountering Yellow Submarine Boy and by Yellow Submarine Boy disappearing, what we have is the protagonist finally opening up to somebody and letting them into his heart. Again, reflected by the pain. It bites his left earlobe. He has a dream of finding a doll in the forest, and the doll bites his left earlobe. And this is a metaphor for leaving an impression in the physical world. And then in the city, the doll needs to bite, or the boy needs to bite his other earlobe in terms of leaving an impression then on the heart. So you have the sort of physical interaction and impression, and then the inner version, allowing that version into himself to leave an impression in his heart, and to then allow that heart to start healing and start moving forward. Because that's really what this book is about. How people, again, just deal with the drama, deal with the pain, become shadows, but also then become whole again. How to heal from the pain. And it's one thing that I think is very unique to The City and its Uncertain Walls, where a lot of Murakami's books deal with massive pain and deal with confronting past traumas, similar to, again, Colorless Kuru Sasaki or Sputnik Sweetheart. But what sets The City and its Uncertain Walls apart is the way that, unlike Colorless, there's no big confrontations, there's no big meetings. This is not a book with climactic moments, a la something like Wind Up Bird Chronicle or Norwegian Wood, or even like towards the ending of Killing Commendatore. This is a very subtle book, a very calm book, probably one of his most relaxing ones yet, taking place in a quiet mountain town, and it's sort of a steady meditation on the process of healing and on becoming whole. And I think that's what it really does that sets it apart from his other works. One closing thing that I think is interesting about this book is the way sex is handled in it, in the sense that it's actually probably the only Murakami book to not have any sex. In fact, the main character, the woman that he does end up seeing at the end of the book, mentions that she has no interest in sex, that she's not able to enjoy sex. And the main character mentions that he's comfortable waiting for her until she's ready, and if she's never ready, then so be it. And I think, part of me wonders if this is in response to the certain accusations leveled against Murakami and the way he handles sex in his novels. But nonetheless, I thought it was an interesting facet of the book that it's one of his books that just doesn't have any sex in it at all. So just was worth mentioning and quite curious. So see you next time for something, who knows what? I don't know.